Good morning, good afternoon, class. So today we're starting with Unit 1, Equations. We're going to start with our first I can. So on page 1 of your notes, you are going to write down this in the first space for your I can, and it is I can solve simple one-step and two-step linear equations. So pause the video now and write this on page 1 in the first blank. All right, now that you have that written down, you're going to go to page 3 and you are going to start with this slide. So I want you to stop and think for a second. What are things that you have done to remember the order of operations? A lot of us use helpful hints, a saying or two. But what do you use to help you? Okay? So think about that for a second. All right, on your notes, we have some vocabulary we have to conquer as a class before we can go forward. I know vocabulary is hard, so we have just a few things to write, and we'll talk more about it in class, all right? So the first words are inverse operations. Well, think about operations, and we're going to think about operations are what we do in math. Operations are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So if you need to write a little note to yourself that operation means addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, please do so. But inverse means opposite. So when we're talking about inverse operations, we're talking about what the opposite operation would be. So opposite operations. We're going to get to those in just a minute, but I need you to know the words, okay? Order of operations. What is that? Well, up until last year, the order of operations was when we were solving something that was given to us without a variable. And so that's what we are talking about when we're saying order of operations, is how we do a problem. Now, we have been using PEMDAS in my class, so please write this down, how we do a problem. Now, we talked a little bit last year about how we do order of operations with variables, because remember, with variables, we actually do it a little differently. Please write this down as well. With variables, we do PEMDAS, but we do it a little bit different. We start with parentheses, we do exponents, then we go to subtraction, addition, multiplication, and division. Equations. Well, I see the word right here that starts off like a word we all know. I see the word equal, okay? So I know that it's a math sentence with an equal sign, okay? Now, that's important because we're going to talk about inequalities later on. So anytime we're talking about an equation, it must have that equal sign, okay? All right, the last word we must conquer before we can get on to what our unit is actually about is variables. Variable is just a letter that stands for numbers. In math, most often when we're just doing a regular equation, we're going to have X stand in for most things. But when we get into things later down the road, we will also have M, we will have Y. And then when we do our geometry unit, we'll have a few others as well, okay? All right, so next, what are some examples of equations? I want you to take a second after I show you some lovely ones, and you're going to write your own in, but So what are some examples of an equation? Well, what about just simply this? X equals 2. That's an equation. Another really great example of an equation is 3x equals 15. Now come up with your own. See if you can come up with your own. I'm going to write one more down so you can just see it. X minus 4 equals 10. Those are all examples of an equation. What is not an equation is this. 2. That's not an equation. Okay? All right. In class, be ready to show your examples of equations. All right, so now let's talk about inverse operations for just a second. So here I have written down, if we see in our equation, if we see an addition sign, if you need to write an addition sign next to it, please do. If you see that addition sign, the opposite is subtraction. It is also true that if we have a positive number, the opposite is a negative number. And here, if we have subtraction, of course we would do addition as the opposite. Okay, now, here are some more examples of equations. Some of these get very complex very quickly. I'm hoping to get to some of these lovely examples right here in the next couple of days. But notice here on the non-examples, there is no equal sign on any of these expressions. So the word changes when we change what we're talking about, okay? So pause the video, write down a few more examples. All right, there are 3 important ideas or goals that we have when we're doing this. The goal of every equation or inequality that we're going to cover is to get the variable or the letter alone. What is done to one side of the equation must be done to the other side. It is like a scale or a teeter-totter. We have to, whenever we are doing one of these equations, we have to do the same thing so that it stays balanced. Because if it doesn't stay balanced, then we have not done our situation right. Okay, and we're going to talk more about this balancing with a few manipulatives in class. Also, our third one is you can only combine like variables or integers, and those are the numbers that don't have any letters. So let's do an example, okay? So the first example I have on the board is x minus 5 is -1 or equals -1. So I'm going to look here, and I see that I have subtraction. I see that I look for my x, and I see what's happening to my x. Well, I see subtraction. So I look back at my list, and I say, well, I have the operation of subtraction. The opposite of subtraction is that plus. We're adding. So I like to put a wall at my equal sign to kind of remind me where my balancing point is. So to get x alone, I'm going to have to add 5 to both sides. So now these two cancel out. If you need to put them in your calculator, that's fine. I'm left with x equals, and then I say -1 plus 5. I type that in my calculator, I write it on a number line, however I do that, and I get 4. Okay? All right, try the next one by yourself and pause the video. All right, now that you've tried this by yourself, let's walk through it with me. So I look at my variable. This time I have the letter P, so I have to keep the letter P. And I see that P is getting added by 5. So to get P alone, I have to subtract by 5. Notice that these two numbers are the same. One is positive and one is negative, but the number itself is the same. Well, if I add 5 on this side right here, subtract 5 on this side right here, I have to subtract 5 on this side. So I say subtract 5. Now these cancel out to 0, and I have P equals, and now I use a calculator and I say -2 minus 5, and that gives me -7. All right, guys, so that is all we have today. Come to class prepared. I'll see you in a few.